Welcome to the Halacha podcast Laman Yishmu with Harav Yosef Yeshaya Braun, Mara Da'asra, and a member of the Crown Heights Beis Din. This podcast is brought to you by the Ask the Rav platform in partnership with Laman Yilmedu, the premier institute for practical halacha learning.
There's an interesting story that happened recently in Eretz Yisrael at a chuppah, where right before the chassan was about to give the ring to the kala, the ring dropped, fell into a ditch, a hole in the floor, and it was impossible to retrieve it, and it was stuck without a ring. And the Rav, the Rosh Hashiva that was there, on the spot decided to be extremely creative, and he asked the chassan if he has on him any money. He took out a bill, 100 shekel, $100, whatever it was, and they used that for the Kiddushin. And this is reported in the media about the creative solution of the Rosh Hashiva at the time. Now, I will mention that B'chlal, our minhag is that generally the chassan does not keep any valuables in his pocket, and certainly a bill of $100 or 100 shekel is a valuable item. The ring, it is clear, it is not a problem for the chassan to hold. I've been often asked that question, if it's okay for the chassan to hold the ring, but normally the chassan anyhow is not the one that holds the ring. The ring is being held by the Rav. Most Rabbanim are not very comfortable to have the ring anywhere else other than their hand to make sure that it's there and there's no problems, as indeed happened in this wedding, that the ring disappeared. I mean, it could have fallen out of the Rav's hand too. But there's really no problem otherwise with the chassan holding the ring. Well, in this case, since the $100 bill was a ring, that was the Kiddushin ring, so therefore technically there's no issue with the fact that the chassan had that in his pocket, because it's okay for him to hold the ring. But the question here really is a different question. Was that the right solution at the time? Was that the way to deal with the issue? So we have a whole discussion in Pesachim about something called a tabas she'ula. Borrowing a ring. And this goes back to the Rosh that discusses this. This is brought down in Hilchos Tzitzis as well. And the association with Hilchos Tzitzis is because to make a bracha on a pair of tzitzis has to be your tzitzis. What happens if you borrow a pair of tzitzis? The Alter Rebbe in the Siddur writes that if you're borrowing a talis, it's best to specify clearly and say that you want it to be matana, nas lahazir, should be given to you as a gift with the intention you're going to be returning it, not to run into any shilas. But they bring there the shittas harash about tabas she'ula, about a borrowed ring. Often the situation was there was no ring and they borrowed a ring from someone in the audience. And that is a problem. It's not so simple because the ring is supposed to belong to the chassan. Or do we say that anan sadi, it is clear, we can testify that the person that borrowed gave with a full intention should become his, because it can't really be a matana al nas lahachzir. That's also a gift in order to return. It also wouldn't work. So what could be done? Often what people do is they ask someone else in the audience if they're willing to give away their ring. And a lot of people, seeing the dilemma that's going on and being concerned for the welfare of the chassan and the kala and for the simcha, would gladly give away the ring, especially that they know they're probably going to get some money for it too. And there's some strong chance they might get it back also. But they're giving it with a full desire to give it away. It's not a matana almanas lahachzir, a gift in order to return, actually giving away the ring. In many places the seder was that the shamish, the structure of a chuppah was there was a rav, a chazan, and a shamish, referred to in Pesachim as rachash. Even the money that's paid to the Rav is called rachash geld. Rav, Rosh Hashiva, Rav, Chazan, Shamish. So that's how a chuppah would run. And the Shamish had a ring, the Kehila's ring, and he would sell it to the parties for the chuppah, and the next day he would buy it back, and he would get his ring back. I mean, I guess those ladies did not have the meaning of always taking with them the ring. People should always know that they're married, as some people have that meaning, which was based on a chinuch. The ring would always go back to the shamish afterwards, who would buy it back. But again, we're talking about in the modern situation, there is no ring, so people sometimes go and take a ring from someone in the audience. What this Rav did was, he actually asked for a dollar bill or shekel bill. And that brings into a serious shaila. There's a discussion if you're allowed to be mekadesh b'matbeya. The Beis Shmuel raises something in the name of the Mordechai, one of the Rishonim, if it's okay to use a matbeya, a coin. Now, most poskim are not concerned at all with the problem of being mekadesh b'matbeya, and they argue that the Mordechai never meant to say that. He was just asking a question. He wasn't making a statement. it is perfectly legitimate to be mekadosh b'matbea, to use a coin. However, the minig is to be mekadosh b'tabas. The Ramah brings a minig, and he says this minig has a source in the Zohar to use a ring. That is the minig, and we don't change the minig. In Yemen, interestingly, that was not the minig. And a lot of the Yemenites, when they came to Eretz Yisrael, they would come up to the chuppah, they would just take out a coin, because they never heard of such a minig. But a lot of Yemenite Rabbanim say, since that became the minig today, Yemenites should follow that minig too. One should not change the minig. The reason for using a ring, there's Kabbalistic reasons, but there are also halachic reasons. A, because of the potential concern that we just mentioned about a coin with a marcha, even though it's not accepted lahalacha. There's also another whole argument that really, today's day and age, the chuppah and Kiddushin happen at the same time. There's the edison and the nisuin. There's 2 stages of marriage. I'm not going to go into the whole lengthy explanation. But today, because right at the same stage of the edison is the nisuin, we do it one after another, already standing under the chuppah, when the chassan gives the item, the ring to the kala. So it becomes, when you give something to the wife, whatever the wife owns, the husband owns. So it becomes the husband's. That means it never became the wife's. And based on that, the Rogatchover has a whole explanation. There are other sources for this as well. The Rebbe explained it, this Rogatchover at length, that when you're giving a garment, which is something that the husband can't wear, specifically a ring, it's actually, he's putting it on her finger. He's not only giving it to her, so it's actually being used as a garment. It's specifically for the wife, and it's not going to go to the husband, therefore that's much better. So certainly somebody shouldn't be looking at l'chatchila to go and use a coin instead of a ring. That is the minig. We shouldn't change the minig, and there's a good reason. There might even be serious problems of not using a ring. Rabbi Braun, I believed, did a chuppah in Russia, and he used a becher. Okay, that's an exception to the rule. They couldn't find everything that we could find today. Technically, it is okay, although according to this Rogatchover argument, it might be a problem because it's supposed to be, the Rogatchover argues, halachically, something that she would wear based on the structure of the chuppah the way we do it today. But there's really a much bigger problem over here, and that is a bill was used. Coins today, and especially bills today, coins have no value. Coins in the past had a specific value to the coin. It was the weight of gold, silver, whatever it was. Today, coin is just a currency, and the government decides this should be considered $1, this should be considered $5 and 5 cents and 10 cents. And certainly, paper bills, which have really no value, they're almost like a shtar choiv. This is a piece of paper that says that you should receive money. Now, this is called a shtar, a document. One of the methods of Kiddushin is shtar, but that means something totally different. That means that there's a shtar that says, Harei at Mukadeshes, and tell b'shtar zeh, that the woman will be Mikudesh through the shtar, through a method called shtar. But here, it wasn't written lishma, it wasn't a shtar Kiddushin, this was a regular shtar of kesef, which who says has value to it. There are those that question very seriously if it's okay to use a shtar, a bill. Now, when a person is faced with a problem where there is no ring, there are poskim that say that it's better to use a coin than a tabash she'ula than a borrowed ring. Many poskim say that the Beit HaGold or the Chashulchan, better than using a borrowed ring, better than that would be to use a coin. And that's probably, presumably, the reason why the Yisrael decided to do so. But this wasn't a coin, like I said, this was a bill. And we also didn't have to get a borrowed ring. We could have gotten a ring as a gift. Maybe that wasn't, I don't know, maybe it wasn't possible. Maybe the audience wasn't prepared to give away a ring. That could very well be. Many Rabbanim often face a situation where there was some shaila in the Kiddushin afterwards, and after the chuppah, they realized, well, there was a problem. So they have the kala return the ring to the chassan, now it becomes the chassan, and they redo the Kiddushin. So there's ways to get rings. The chassan doesn't have the ring anymore. He gave it to his kala. The kala was prepared to give it back. And there's always someone in the audience. The mother of the chassan would be willing to give away her ring, or whatever the case is. There is a sefer called Tiv Kiddushin, and he says that a borrowed ring versus a coin, better to use both. Because the minig is dafka to use a ring, some say, no, this is a minig that doesn't have a source in officially in halacha. I mentioned the Rogatchover svara that was developed many years later. But a ring is a zoyer or that, but a coin is really no problem with a coin. A borrowed ring is problematic. Use a coin rather than a borrowed ring. The Tiv Kiddushin says, no, the minig is to use a ring, let's use both. So, I will say that Tzemach Tzedek actually writes, I don't think he brings the Tiv Kiddushin, but he specifically writes that there's no advantage in using both. It actually creates a problem. We don't really know which one is she having in mind when she's doing a Kiddushin. You can't say, well, I have the ring and the coin. Maybe the intention here was only the ring, and the ring is a borrowed ring. So that really won't work. So back to that story, in my opinion, it would have been better to get a proper ring from someone as a gift and use it at the wedding without going into any shilas.
A brief ad, and we'll be right back to the podcast. Every shliach is also a rav. But do you have the knowledge to answer the halachic questions that come your way? Join the Rav Kihila course with Rabbi Tuvia Kasimov. Gain the clarity and confidence to respond to the shilas your community brings you. Reserve your spot now at lamanyilmadu.com.
Talking about shilas that came up recently, it was a big issue that came up in one of the Beis Hiraz in Eretz Yisrael. I received the shaila as well, and as the nature of some of these shailas, they travel from one bezin to another bezin. But by the time I got it, wasn't relevant anymore, but it was this discussion that came up in Eretz Yisrael, and they passed on the question here as well. There was a Shabbos sheva brachos. I believe this was in Ashdod, and there was a woman in Bnei Barak that prepared dessert for the Shabbos sheva brachos. And as part of the dessert had in it, if I recall correctly the situation, a chocolate on top. And she made 100 beautiful, nice pieces of cake, dessert, ice cream, whatever it was, with a chocolate on top. And after Shabbos came in, she discovered that the dessert that she sent was unfortunately milchig. That means all the people that are going to be sitting by the sheva brachos will be eating milchigs in a fleishig meal at the sheva brachos. What could be done at this stage? So there is an organization called, I think, Ezer Mitzion, some organization which has a Shabbos Goy working for them, and the idea came up, we'll have the Shabbos Goy of the organization travel to Ashdod, take a car, travel to Ashdod, and inform the people as soon as possible they should not eat the dessert because the dessert is milchig. The question was asked of a Rav in Bnei Barak if they're allowed to tell the guy to drive, and the Rav said no. We'll talk now soon about the lamdas, why yeah, why no, different svaras, and later many Rabbanim or other people gave shiurim and wrote kontresim about this topic. But just to share an interesting story, the woman was very concerned about this. That means she'll be the cause of so many people being michshol, and the Rav told her, if you're doing the right thing, you don't have to worry. I don't know if this is the meifis of this Rav, or the woman's Yiddish Shemayim. The reality is that in Matzah Shabbos, they found that no one ate the dessert because the shevrachs went so long and they decided to push it off and they'll use it as a Matzah Shabbos dessert. So Baruch Hashem, they were all saved from a michshol. So now let's talk about the reasons why it would be okay or not okay. Here's the issur of Amidul Nachri. You're not allowed to tell a guy to do melacha for you on Shabbos, to do even the issur derabim. Now, in some cases where there's a great need of a mitzvah, we can ask a guy to do a derabim, something which is only rabbinically forbidden. To ask a guy to take a car and drive on Shabbos is issur deraisa. You can't have a guy doing issur deraisa unless we're talking about a choyle or a katan, whatever, a number of things. Under normal circumstances, you can't have a guy do melacha deraisa for you. So it would seem the straightforward argument would be that you're not allowed to ask the guy to do this. However, there's a shittas habal ha'iter. The Bala Itter, one of the Rishonim, says not only for bris milah, but even for any other mitzvah, any time it involves an issue of a mitzvah, you're allowed to have a goy do a melacha deraisa to allow you to do a mitzvah. The Ramah brings down that in many places, if it would become dark Friday night at the meal, they would have a goy turn on the light, or more correctly, light the candles, even though that's a issur deraisa, because in order to be able to eat the Suda Shabbos properly, not in the dark, in order to be able to perform a mitzvah, so they rely on the opinion of the Bala Itter. However, this is a limud schus. This is a way to defend the behavior of people. When the Alter Rebbe brings this Ramah, he writes that we shouldn't protest about those who are lenient and rely on the Bala Itter. The Ramah says the same thing, but he adds a few important words. We shouldn't protest because they will not listen, implying that it is actually wrong. Not we don't protest because they have what to rely on, because they won't listen to us. Because people think, yeah, I'm getting a guy, I'm not doing it, I'm telling the guy, what's the problem? But according to halacha, the halacha is not like the Baal Eiter, and you can't get a guy to do a melacha d'oraisa for a mitzvah. And so back to our case again, we wouldn't be able to tell the guy. But here comes another argument. Many poskim say that in a case when there's a michshol, to protect people from doing an avera, a michshol derabim, many people are going to go through a michshol, then it would be okay to have a guy do a melacha d'oraisa. And they talk specifically about an eruv that was ripped, and we have to have the guy to fix the eruv. And so because people will be carrying in the place where there's no eruv, so now we're protecting people from a michshol, that even more seriously. In some places it just says mitzvah derabim. For a mitzvah derabim, it's okay to do a d'oraisa. Now, first of all, that's not so straightforward. There are many sources that would imply that even for a mitzvah derabim, you can have a guy do a melacha. And when we talk about mitzvah derabim, it's not very clear if it means a mitzvah that is done berabim, a mitzvah like tefillah b'tzibur, a mitzvah which is incumbent on the rabbim, a mitzvah where there's a zikur rabbim. We often find when we're talking about even mitzvahs d'oraisis, such as shofar and lulav, which are often done. It's many people need a shofar in town. Many people need a lulav, and we're talking about having goyim doing melachas d'oraisa, and it comes out clearly you can't do that. I want to point out that there's a very interesting Alter Rebbe which defines, the Gemara uses the term mitzvah derabim. And Alter Rebbe defines, specifically this Gemara is referring to the mitzvah of tefillah b'tzibur, that tefillah b'tzibur, that's what Alter Rebbe learns in this Gemara, is more important than any other mitzvah in the Torah because it's a mitzvah of being mekadesh, shem, shemayim, barab, where everybody is getting together and sanctifying Hashem's name. So not every mitzvah that many people are doing, like shofar, a bunch of people are doing shofar, would be called a mitzvah derabim. But either way, the argument of mitzvah derabim is not so simple. But what about the svara of michshol derabim, protecting people from stumbling? So this is brought often from a sefer called Pana Me'iros. But if you actually look in the Pana Me'iros, it's very interesting, although so many people call this Pana Me'iros. When you open the Pana Me'iros, you see very clearly he actually was not comfortable with allowing a guy to do a melacha d'oraisa because of a case of a michshol. Over there, what people will carry, but it's not about an eruv that was ripped. He was very stringent, and he was going to argue even not to let it go to do a derabim, what we call a shvus de shvus. So to use this argument, even though some place can bring this, when you look at the original source, this becomes problematic. There's another point here, that when we're talking about a michshol derabim, that means a michshol for a city, not a michshol for a few individuals sitting by a sheva brachos. And there are many cases where poskim talk about problems that would have been a michshol, and they did not allow to do a middle and achri. So it's very hard to use that argument. The Eshel Avram brings about a case of an eruv, and he says the guy is going to do only a derabim in fixing the eruv. In fact, there's another question here. What kind of michshol are we talking about? Are people going to carry in a way that's issa d'oraisa or issa derabim? So if we're talking about an eruv, usually the very fact that it means that you could put up strings, ropes, and not put doors over there, that itself implies that the place is only a problem to carry midrabanan. So that tells us that even some midrabanan would be okay, but on the other hand, what kind of thing is the guy doing? Is he doing a deraisa or is he doing a drabanan? There's a separate question, when people carry the eruv is ripped, they really don't even know that they're carrying. So they're not doing a melacha, they're not doing a mezid, they're not even doing a shoigig. A shoigig means when you don't know today is Shabbos, or you don't know that what you're doing is melacha. Here it's not they don't know what they're doing is melacha, they don't know what they're doing. We call them misasik. When somebody wants to cut something, and he wants to cut an apple, and by mistake he's cutting an apple which is attached to a tree, and he thought he's cutting an apple which is not attached to a tree. That's called misasik, which is questionable if bichlal that's considered a derabim, or maybe even less than a derabim. That's dependent on a lot of chakiras, and which is why it's hard to understand what would be the heter to have a guy fix the eruv if people are not even going to be over issa derabim. And it could be because misasik is also a form of isser, or could be the concern was that there's some people that even if the eruv is ripped and they know it's ripped, they'll still continue to carry because that's just what they're used to doing, and maybe that's why the poskim over there allowed it. So going back to our case over here, let's think about the case over here. They're going to be eating ice cream, milchig ice cream, in a fleishig meal, but they're not going to be eating it together. So they're not going to be violating Isser D'Oraisa. It's not cooked together. First of all, in order to be an Isser D'Oraisa, it has to be cooked together. It's not cooked together, and it's not eating it together, it's eating it one after another. More than that, many people, I don't know what was at that Sheva brachos, Friday night, they eat chicken. According to many shittas, after chicken, strictly speaking, it's okay to eat milk. The problem is only after meat. Okay, that's the whole discussion. That's not more the halacha that we follow. But we're trying to understand the nature of the michshol. Would this be okay to allow to have a goy to do an isser of driving, which is isser d'oraisa? We will be violating isser derabim of telling a goy, but we're asking to do isser d'oraisa to protect people from doing something which is a potential michshol of a derabim. So who says that would be permissible? That isn't so simple. So the Rav who was asked this question, he held that it was forbidden. There's another whole discussion. Sometimes we say, that we don't tell one person to sin that other people should be protected. And sometimes we say, it's better I do a small aveda to protect people from a big aveda. And that's a whole sugya. The argument that it's better to do a small aveda to protect people from a big aveda doesn't usually fly, and in this case also seems like it wouldn't fly. But the question is, if it's enough of a tzorech to ask a guy, if it would be a derabim, that we wouldn't have a problem with that. To make a phone call, that wouldn't be a problem. But to do a deraisa, to drive, that's very hard to be matter. But someone raised a different question altogether. That wasn't the original question that the Rav was asked. Someone raised the question, there could be someone that's allergic to milchigs. Now that's already an issue of sakana. So why wouldn't it be mutter for the guy to drive there to protect people from a sakana? But now we have to go into another whole discussion that when it comes to sakana, we need to be aware, even though a suffix sakana is also something, but also it's only when there's choil lefanenu. We know of someone that's allergic, who might be there, who might not be there. That we can understand. But the fact that in the world is statistically always going to be people that are allergic, a kohen is not allowed to learn nituche mason, operate in dead bodies, learn medicine, and become tummy to a dead body, because he could become a doctor and help people in the future. So there's a lot of halachas associated with how we define pikuach nefesh, for that to allow a goy to do a deraisa. So if we were talking about having the goy do a derabim, I wouldn't have a problem with that. The fact that maybe someone is allergic, that would be okay. But for such a far-fetched thing, the amount of people that we're having a daily allergy could be fatal is a very, very small percentage, almost non-existent, where it actually would be fatal. So it'd be very hard to be matter based on that logic. And that was that interesting story. And from there I'm going to come to another interesting story that happened a couple of weeks ago. There was in one of the Chassidus, one of the Rebbes of today.
A brief ad, and we'll be right back to the podcast. Shabbos comes once a week, and you've probably told yourself more than once, it's time I learn Hilchos Shabbos. Well, now the time has come. Join the Hilchos Shabbos Halacha L'Maaseh course with Rabbi Yossi Barber and learn the halachas clearly and practically. For details and registration, visit lemanyilmadu.com.
So sister passed away a particular morning. Her sister is also a Rebbetzin of one of the Chassidus, and she wasn't well. But the Rebbe went to daven Shachris, this particular Rebbe, and they discovered that she passed away, and therefore the Rebbe became an oinen, and his whole... I'm not going to talk about him attending the chuppah later. That was another whole discussion. But the issue that we're talking about right now was they did not say tachna because they just thought there's going to be a bris after davening. And there's a sandik. The Rebbe was there. This particular Rebbe was going to serve a sandik. But then when they discovered that his sister really passed away, that means he's not is no bris, he's not a sandik. Therefore, by mistake, they didn't say tachna. So the dayanim in that particular community paskined that they have to make this up, and they have to say V'hu Rachum, which is part of the davening of Monday and Thursday. They have to say it later. They said they should say it at Mincha. So let's examine this halacha. So we know there's a din that you're not supposed to talk from Shemoneh Esrei to Tachna. It's really one continuation. Tachna belongs right after Shemoneh Esrei. The Alter Rebbe addresses a case where people were in a house of a mourner where there's no Tachna and no V'hu Rachum, and he says they don't have to make it up not only the tachna, but even the v'hurachem, they don't have to make up when they get home. Because if it wasn't said in the spot where you're supposed to say it, it's pushed off completely. V'hurachem is a minig to say, and the minig is if you're obligated at the time. You were not obligated at the time, you were exempt at the time, so now you're exempt further on also. However, there's two points that we need to take into account. Number one, the Alter Rebbe is talking about in a nusach, which is not our nusach, the v'hurachem is said right after Shemoneh Esrei, before Tachnan. The Tillel David makes that distinction. We can argue with that distinction. We can say that Tachnan v'hurachem is one unit, whether you say v'hurachem first or Tachnan first, but the Tillel David makes this distinction. The other distinction is, Alter Rebbe is talking about in a case where the person was actually exempt. They actually were in a mourner's house. Not that a person by mistake forgot to say it. Not we made a mistake and we thought we were exempt. So in such a case, there's actually a strong argument to say, yes, you have to make it up. In the case where the chassan by mistake says Kaddish and not Tachnan, and afterwards we discover he made a mistake, he should really go and make up and say Tachnan afterwards. Really, you're not allowed to talk, you're supposed to say Tachnan right after Shemoneh Esrei. But if you did make a break, then you should say Tachnan afterwards. The Alter Rebbe was talking about in a case where they were exempt. Once they're exempt, they remain exempt for the future also. Moving on to another topic altogether. A few weeks ago, we spoke about various letters printed in the back of the Kiddushin and how those letters were printed independently afterwards, and sometimes there's changes. Now, sometimes in the back of Kiddushin there's what we call minus, and short answers that the Rebbe wrote, and we spoke about sometimes there were mistakes in the way they were given over, because they received it sometimes from the maskiras, from the file of the Rebbe Secretariat, and sometimes they got it from private people, and when you get a hataka, you get a copy of something, you don't get the original, it could be mistaken. We spoke about some examples. Just one other example that comes to mind, we spoke about it a few weeks ago, we can look back and listen to those examples, but another example that comes to mind is, there's a particular letter of the Rebbe about where to put the mezuzah. Mini Chabad, as we go according to the hinges, the way you go into the room, that's how we define the mezuzah, except for the front door. And someone asked the Rebbe what happens with a side door, and the Rebbe wrote, with a side door is not like a front door when we follow what we call heker tzir. That's how it's printed on Kutasichis. However, the individual who asked this question, now we have all the details. In Kutasichis, we only have the one-liner. The Rebbe, he actually asked the Rebbe a question, Ha'im yesh li'eschashe b'knisas dadas b'heker tzir, question mark, and the Rebbe circled the whole thing with the question mark. Now, I'm not saying conclusively one way or another. It could be the Rebbe left it as a question, or could the Rebbe meant to circle it. Often the Rebbe would circle, that's the statement. And the Rebbe also circled the question mark. His question was, it's not very clear, and there's a lot of debate about how we deal with side entrances, and it could depend on many other factors, but that's not the subject of our shir now, so let's move on to our next topic. The minhag Chabad is that in Shemoneh Esrei, in the bracha of Moedim, we say, Hatoiv ki lechalu rachamecha, hamerachim ki leisamu chasadecha. If you look carefully in the Chabad Siddur, in Shabbos and Yom Tov davening, it says v'hamerachim. And indeed, it's not a typo. The minig is that there's a distinction between weekday and Shabbos and Yom Tov. That weekday we say hamerachim, and on Shabbos and Yom Tov we say v'hamerachim. Interesting to note that the very first print of the Alter Rebbe Siddur, it seems like that was the first print, which was discovered a few years ago in the library in Russia, is some changes, and over there isn't any change between weekday and Shabbos. It's always hamerachim, but we have this as a tradition. The Rebbe's great-grandfather, Shar HaKoil, says he asked this question to the Hillel Paratcher, and the Hillel Paratcher indeed told him that Shabbos and Yom Tov is different. It's supposed to be the hamerachim, and he suggested an explanation over there that it has to do with the amount of vavs. The amount of vavs, there should be a total of 12 vavs, because in Shabbos we don't have a regular Shemoneh Esrei, we don't have the 18 or 19 brachos, so we want to make up for this by all the extra vavs and moedim. That's his suggested explanation that the Shar HaKoil wants to suggest. He's not sure if this applies also to Rosh Chodesh, to Chol HaMoed, but we have in Sefer HaManhagim an instruction of the Frierdiker Rebbe that any time when there's a musaf, in musaf is v'hamerachim. So it would apply to Rosh Chodesh and to Chol HaMoed as well. The Rebbe in his private diary wrote about the Rebbe Rashab that when he had yahrzeit, he would swallow the vav and say in a way that people shouldn't notice, but he would say v'hamerachim when he had yahrzeit. So it's an interesting thing that he had a minute to say v'hamerachim on a day of yahrzeit. It could be this is the yard side of Yud Gimel Tishrei, which is when the Rebbe Rashab had yard side for his father, which is the day where we don't say Tachton. Because the Rebbe, in the later years, there was a modification of the Rebbe's behavior. It seems like the Rebbe started saying, whenever there was no Tachton, Musif or Shachris, makes no difference. They doesn't have Musif. The Rebbe started more and more consistently always saying, V'hamanachim, there's no Tachton. Now, we don't know the reasons for these things. It's beyond our understanding. It could be the Rebbe wanted that, maybe in the yard side, it's a day to bring down more Rachmim. A day we don't say Tachton. There's another method to bring down Rachmim. Rabbi Chitzuk wrote a sefer called Rishimas Devarim, and he had a bunch of suggestions. What's the difference between Tov and Merachim, and what's the V'hamarachim coming down from Tov Be'etzim? Again, these are all suggestions which we don't know if any of them are correct or not correct. And I'll just finish with one thing. I got a question from someone who is not from a different community, asking about meat when a person is mourning during Avelis. Now the halacha is that an oinen, until the mace is buried, is not allowed to eat meat. There's no halacha about sheva. But I discovered, interestingly, that there's some communities that actually had such a minig. In Morocco and other communities, they wouldn't eat meat throughout sheva. Is that a legitimate minig? Is that not a legitimate minig? So it's not, in our circles, there's no such minig. There's one of the poskim from Jerba brings it about such a minig not to eat meat even on Shabbos, and he writes this minig was made up by the people, they made their own ideas, it has no source. Rav Avad Yosef writes that people who have this minig don't even have to do Ataras Nadarim because it's a mistake, the whole entire minig. However, there are some sources for this minig, genuine sources that bring this minig. And some of these early sources of a sefer called Mishpat Tzedek, there's more than one Mishpat Tzedek. This Mishpat Tzedek was one of the Chachamim in Greece over 400 years ago. He writes clearly that they needed to have someone who in a place where they had this minig. If they all stopped, the minig is one thing. The guy was sick and he wanted to have meat. He says he should really do Hataras Nadarim. And the words of the Mishpat Tzedek are brought in Leket HaKemach and in Mayim Rabbin and many other Svarim. Chaim Palaji, which we quoted a few times in our recent classes, recent podcasts. So to say you don't need Hataras Nadarim is very, very difficult. The Sefer Shoel V'Nishal that says that this minig has no basis is most likely referring to the fact that even on Shabbos they don't eat meat, and that's going very extreme. Be that as it may, that is not the common minig by us. I don't want to finish with the inin of Avelis, so let's talk about the importance of eating meat on Shabbos, meat and wine, and even if Tisha B'Av would fall on Shabbos, we eat meat and wine because the idea, it's a time of simcha. Now that the 3 weeks are coming in, we know B'Pnimis is really days of great simcha. It's only B'Chitzonius that it seems like days of mourning, and in Mitzvah Hashem, that Pnimius will be fully revealed b'kar of Mamish.
Join the global halacha learning revolution of the Laman Yilmadu Institute and bring increased brachos into your home. For details about the various learning programs, visit our website, lamanyilmadu.com. That's LEMAANYILMEDU.com.